Altdorf, prize jewel and capital of the Empire, and home to the throne of the Emperor and Prince Karl Franz. But all is not right in these glorious and fertile lands. After the election of Karl Franz to the throne as Emperor, a secessionist movement unhappy with the election has forcefully taken large swaths of the Reikland. Grunburg to the east, Ubersreik to the south, and Eilhart to the west have all fallen to secessionist control. Worse still, the fortress and trade town Helmgart, nestled in Axbite Pass, has also fallen to the secessionist subterfuge. In comparison, the secessionist threat is minuscule, for to the east further still, beyond the neighboring Stirland in Sylvania, lies the vampires von Karstein and their ilk, corrupting the land and amassing vicious armies of the slave dead. An even greater threat still. But Karl Franz must first unite the Empire against these threats, or at least the Reikland. He moves with his warband of imperial troops toward the nearest secessionist army, led by the traitorous Helmut Ludendorff. With nearly 800 men, Karl Franz marched headlong toward the waiting traitor army. Beneath the barrage of mortar fire, the nearly 600 secessionists quickly began to falter, with an entire regiment of swordsmen falling victim before the lines even met. But there was no fleeing, for the trap was set. As the lines clashed, cavalry flanked north to the hills behind the battle lines to meet the secessionist archers, laying waste to them with ease.
Destroy it!
Behind them, 2 regiments of imperial handgunners. The trap was sprung, and there was nowhere to flee beneath the hail of gunfire. Karl Franz himself, surrounded by his imperial greatswords, met the traitor Ludendorff in battle. Wielding Galmaraz, Karl Franz made short work of the treacherous usurper, who fled the field of battle while the remains of his former army were slaughtered. A decisive victory for Sigmar's heir, with only 40 lost men. Of the nearly 600 men in the traitor's army, 360 were slain. Of the remaining 200, 180 were summarily executed. With Ludendorff decimated, Karl Franz turns to Grunburg, a relatively small town known for its boatyards constantly churning out ferries for the insatiable appetite for trade in the Reikland. As such, it fields only a meager garrison, though larger in number than Ludendorff's warband. Grunburg is no stranger to battle, however, with its fields to the southeast being known as the Battle Plains. If the small secessionist garrison will not surrender, Karl Franz will once again make sure the Battle Plains run red. The usurpers did not surrender, and instead nearly 800 sallied forth to the Battle Plains to the waiting Karl Franz. Seeing the tremendous line of infantry before him and unable to match the width of the enemy formation, Karl Franz ordered the cavalry to charge headlong into the enemy line and stall them while the handgunners moved into position. The lines clashed, and Karl Franz broke through the line and laid waste to the enemy general and his men. As the garrison retreated, Karl Franz and his men gave no quarter, leaving only 120 of the 800 alive. But the Emperor's own forces took 20 more losses than the first skirmish, losing 63 men. Perhaps he had underestimated the resolve of the Secessionists. The Emperor took this into careful consideration and hired 2 regiments of the Free Company militia. Money was no object to the Prince of Altdorf. As the bodies were collected and burned in Grunburg, a letter arrived. The College of Celestial Magic in Altdorf would be sending a volunteer named Fritz Ruprecht to aid the Emperor's noble mission.
Ready. What?
Karl marched through the Reikland forest and rendezvoused with Fritz, who brought with him 2 regiments of Imperial spearmen.
Now.
The stage was set for the reclamation of Ubersreik. The same offer: recognize Karl Franz Holzwig-Schlestein as the rightfully elected emperor, or perish. The treasonous garrison of Ubersreik chose the latter. Allowing the celestial wizard to prove his usefulness, and having recruited over 1,000 men to his imperial army, Karl Franz elected to observe the battle from behind. The horses were tired from the march and stayed in reserve. This battle would be decided with gunpowder and shot, and the ever-dutiful imperial swords and spearmen.
We are mere men. What have they to fear?
But shortly after the battle began, however, and with his keen eye spotting a central gap in the enemy defenses, Karl Franz tested the celestial wizard's mettle and ordered him to charge alongside him while signaling to the cavalry with a deafening rally cry to exploit another gap to the west to assault the backlines. The enemy fled, scattered like parchment in the wind. And so Karl Franz reformed the main line and permitted his militiamen, handgunners, and cavalry to finish the stragglers off.
I hope the battle wizards spread out! The elector comes. By the gods, keep clear!
Karl Franz and Fritz wasted no time after their victory at Ubersreik, lest word traveled too quickly about the offensive. Karl Franz was gifted a famed warhorse by the united people of Ubersreik from the stables at Magnus's tower, and Fritz set forth conscripting the population. Another 240 swordsmen joined the Emperor's army, bringing its strength to nearly 1,500 men. Swiftly they marched on Eilhart. Karl Franz positioned himself to the northeast of the city, where the 800-strong garrison sallied forth to meet him. Emboldened by the victory at Ubersreik and sufficiently pleased by the resolve of Fritz, the celestial wizard who valiantly charged into battle with him, Karl Franz elected to give Fritz the frontline troops to the northwest, while he, atop his warhorse, would support with the cavalry, gunners, and militia in the south. The plan was simple. The enemy presented a wide line, so use the terrain to bait them to the north, and use the militiamen, cavalry, and gunners to flank to the south, using the hills to conceal their approach. But the enemy was wise. Perhaps doubting the tactical acumen of Fritz, the men moved slowly and were intercepted just as they arrived at their positions, and the Secessionists didn't take the bait. They split their forces, with the northern force of 2 spearmen regiments supported by an archer regiment, and the southern force of 3 regiments of swordsmen and 1 of spearmen, rapidly charging the out-of-position cavalry and gunners, forcing the Empire's southern flank to retreat. Fritz ordered the unarmored great swordsmen to fall into reserves, keeping them safe from the hail of arrows. As Karl Franz and the cavalry withdrew, the northern forces were flanked around the rock central to the battlefield and caught unaware. Karl Franz had no choice but to send forth the cavalry and exploit the gap in the enemy's line. He first sent them to the south to the separated enemy spearmen, freeing the gunners while he himself charged headlong toward the 3 flanking regiments of swordsmen. Seeing this, the great swords in reserve also charged headlong toward the flanking enemy. The cavalry rapidly shifted to the back line, silencing the bows and allowing the remainder of the front line to flank, as the gunnery regiment shifted their focus now on freeing the embattled Emperor and greatswords. The enemy rapidly faltered to this quick response, and victorious cheers were heard resounding in the frontline troops around Karl Franz amidst the staccato crack of gunfire and hooves of their comrades seeking revenge for their fallen. Though embarrassed by the potentially catastrophic blunder, which resulted in the deaths of 80 men, Karl Franz had united the Reikland. He hired from Eilhart more Free Company militia and sent orders to continue renovations and construction at Altdorf, building a clay pit and defensive walls. Altdorf would again become the trade capital he knew it to be. But word traveled of a vacant seat on the Council of States. Stirland and Averland sought to claim these seats, and thus the endorsement of the Emperor. Karl Franz chose Averland to gain the seat and set his eyes on the fortress town of Helmgart.
On march!
As he marched along the river Schilder, he recruited 240 more swordsmen. There, at the foot of the Grey Mountains in the March of Helmgart before Axbite Pass, a diplomat from the Elector Count of Stirland, Albrecht Haupt Anderson, arrives claiming that Talabecland holds a region called the Needling, which has historically belonged to Stirland. Knowing that Stirland remains a bastion between Sylvania and the Reikland, the Emperor demands the return of the Needling to Stirland. His army marches forward into Axbite Pass as construction and improvements continue in the Reikland, and there, in the March of Helmgart, a scout reports back that word of the Empire offensive against the Secessionists had indeed made it to the fortress, and an army far greater than those he had just faced had garrisoned itself in the fortress town. Karl Franz orders his men to hide amongst the trees and wait.